The earliest maps of our world carry a strange kind of silence. You can see it in the faint lines where coastlines should be sharper, in the scattered names of settlements that appear once and are never written again, in the gentle smudges where ink fades around places that no longer have stories to tell. They look ordinary at first glance, like artifacts from a quieter age, yet the more you stare, the more the paper seems to argue with itself. Rivers flow toward mountains that no longer exist. Roads connect to towns that no historian has placed on any known soil. Entire regions pulse with activity in one century, then vanish without trace in the next, as though someone had reached into the map and lifted whole communities off the page. It is the absence that draws the eye, small, irregular, deliberate, as if the world once held far more than we are allowed to remember. On certain maps, ancient and early modern alike, you find the outlines of cultures described by explorers with unnerving confidence, their notes filled with detail, weather patterns, trade routes, and rituals. Yet these cultures leave no ruins, no artifacts, no graves. They disappear into the fog of later records, replaced by blank terrain or renamed as something simpler, easier to categorize, more convenient to explain. Anyone can miss it when looking casually. But if you trace the same coastline across centuries of cartography, something unsettling happens. Settlements flicker in and out like signals from a dying star. Boundaries warp and correct themselves, and in the places where the most detail once lived, the ink grows suspiciously thin. So we return to the oldest question hidden in the margins of every forgotten border. What kind of civilization leaves behind only the shape of its erasure? History, as most of us learn it, unfolds in a steady and orderly line. Civilizations rise, expand, trade, war, decline, and leave behind relics to anchor their stories. Every region, we are told, fits into a known sequence of migrations and cultures, each accounted for, each catalogued by archaeology and the written word. Loss is expected, but only in gaps between empires, never in entire landscapes. The official narrative offers reassurance that nothing essential has vanished, that our understanding of the past might be incomplete but is not fundamentally wrong. Within that narrative, early explorers made mistakes, misread coastlines, misheard the names of local peoples, or exaggerated what they saw. Maps shifted not because the world changed, but because our measurements improved. A missing settlement is explained as a misunderstanding. A misdrawn river is blamed on fog or faulty instruments. The world, we are taught, was messy to document, not mysterious in itself. But when you examine the same documents through a slower lens, a different feeling begins to form. The inconsistencies do not scatter randomly. They form clusters. They appear along the same migration corridors, the same rivers, the same mountain passes that ancient people depended upon. Entire populations mentioned by early navigators vanish from later ethnographic surveys, not gradually, but all at once, erased in the space between two map editions. The surface-level explanation says this is nothing more than the natural evolution of cartography. As science advanced, inaccuracies dissolved, the world sharpened, errors died out, and yet, the places that disappear are often the ones described with the greatest confidence, drawn carefully, sometimes with measurements that match modern geography with uncanny precision. These were not vague rumours. They were documented as though the cartographer had walked their streets. Still, most people accept the official view because it offers closure. It tells us the world is mapped in full, that there are no remaining unknowns, that earlier records were simply flawed. But beneath these familiar explanations is an older, quieter truth. History is written by those who survive, and maps are curated by those who believe they already know the shape of the world, which leaves us with a possibility that rarely enters public conversation. What if some places did not fade because of cartographic error, but because something happened that removed both the people and their memory? And why does that possibility appear only where the ink grows faint? The first anomaly appears innocently, tucked inside a set of coastal charts drawn in the early 16th century. These maps, produced by Portuguese navigators mapping the western coast of Africa, contain the usual features one would expect: capes, bays, currents, and markers of known kingdoms. But among them, a single settlement appears again and again, rendered with consistency across multiple voyages, as if its presence were beyond dispute. The name varies slightly by dialect, but the descriptions do not. A fortified town inland from the shore, surrounded by cultivated fields and stone structures of surprising size. Traders described its markets, its architecture, even the patterns on its walls. Then, within a generation, it vanishes. By the mid-17th century, every map omits it entirely. Later historians call it a misunderstanding, a European misinterpretation of local geography. Yet the earlier maps agree with one another with unusual precision, drawn by different hands at different times, cross-validated by notes that reference travel distances and landmarks that still exist today. To dismiss the settlement as a cartographic error requires assuming that experienced navigators made the exact same mistake for decades, while describing the same features with matching detail. Even more unsettling is what appears beneath the soil in the region where the city should have been. Archaeologists find scattered pottery, traces of terracing, and fragments of worked stone that show a style inconsistent with surrounding cultures. Not enough to recreate a city, but enough to imply something larger once stood here, something organized, something deliberate. And yet no ruins, no central plaza, no evidence of a destruction layer. It is as though the place dissolved rather than collapsed. A common-sense question emerges. How can a city large enough to appear repeatedly in official maritime charts leave behind almost no structural remains? Cities do not simply evaporate. They do not abandon their foundations. If erased by conflict, fire, or natural disaster, the imprint would remain. But here, the land carries only faint signatures, as though someone had removed the stones individually, leaving only the smallest traces behind. The more one reads the explorers' journals, the stranger it becomes. They describe the inhabitants with familiarity, noting specific customs not found among nearby groups. They mention goods that imply a thriving network of trade. They speak of precise distances from the coast, distances that match modern measurement. This was no rumour carried on the wind. It was recorded as a certainty. Yet somehow, the official historical narrative says the settlement never existed. That contradiction forms the first crack. Not because the city itself is extraordinary, but because its disappearance required a level of silence impossible to attribute to chance. A place documented so carefully, mapped so repeatedly, should not be able to fall out of memory unless something intervened. Which raises a question that does not fit within the accepted timeline. How do you explain a city that was known well enough to map, yet forgotten well enough to erase? The second anomaly comes from a very different corner of the world, yet it carries the same unsettling shape. In the early 17th century, Jesuit missionaries in South America documented a network of inland communities that occupied the high ridges between the Maranon and Huallaga rivers. Their journals described these settlements with unusual clarity, noting the height of their walls, the organization of their terraces, and the distinctive pattern of their stonework. They wrote of broad roads carved into the mountainsides and of stone markers used for navigation, each positioned with a level of precision that suggested advanced surveying knowledge. For decades, these accounts circulated among European mapmakers. Many atlases included the settlements as fixed points, marking them with the same confidence given to known cities along the coast. But by the 18th century, the settlements begin to fade. First, the names change, then the markers shrink. Eventually they vanish from the maps entirely, replaced by empty terrain or vague references to uninhabited highlands. When modern researchers search these locations, they find something almost impossible. The mountains hold evidence of habitation, but the structures do not match the descriptions in the early accounts. The terraces remain, but they're shallower, more weathered, and fewer in number. The stonework is present, but fragmented, scattered, as though dismantled intentionally. No large settlements appear. No road system emerges. It is as if the landscape has been thinned, reduced to only the faintest memory of what was once there. The missionary journals, however, read like eyewitness testimony. They mentioned building techniques that would require coordinated labour. They describe plazas large enough for gatherings. They reference water systems engineered to divert rainfall across stepped fields. These are not details one invents casually, nor mistakes one repeats across multiple expeditions. And yet, nothing of that scale remains. The traditional explanation says the journals exaggerated, that unfamiliar terrain and cultural misunderstanding led to inflated reports. But these same writers documented other regions accurately. Their descriptions of nearby valleys match modern archaeological findings almost exactly. They were not prone to fantasy. Their precision elsewhere makes their supposed mistakes here difficult to accept. What emerges instead is a quiet contradiction. The accounts suggest a population large enough to sustain complex agriculture, advanced enough to master mountain engineering, and established enough to appear on multiple European maps. Yet the physical record is diminished, pared down to fragments too small to reconcile with the written descriptions. This anomaly is harder to ignore. It is geographically isolated, cross-referenced, and supported by measurements still visible in the terrain. And its disappearance cannot be explained by conquest, disease, or collapse alone. Something removed both the settlements and their memory with astonishing efficiency. So we are left with a disquieting thought. How can a culture capable of reshaping mountains be reduced to remnants that look as though they were intentionally undone? The official explanations for disappearances like these tend to follow a familiar pattern. Historians point first to cartographic error, noting that early mapmakers often relied on second-hand reports filtered through layers of translation and assumption. Next comes the argument of exaggeration, the idea that explorers and missionaries embellished their findings to secure funding, impress their patrons, or assert the importance of their work. And finally, there is the explanation of natural decay, the assumption that time erodes all structures unless they're built on a monumental scale. These explanations are reasonable on the surface. They fit comfortably within the framework of how history is taught, suggesting that human error and environmental forces are enough to account for entire settlements slipping from record. It is an argument that reassures rather than questions, but when applied to the anomalies themselves, the logic phrase quickly. Consider the consistency across early maps. Errors vary wildly in form, yet the settlements in question are depicted with similar shapes, similar placements, and similar distances relative to known landmarks. If these were mistakes, they were remarkably uniform, reproduced by different hands separated by borders, languages, and decades. Mistakes repeat, but not with precision, not with shared measurements, not with matching architectural details across multiple sources. The exaggeration argument also weakens under scrutiny. The missionaries who described the mountain settlements in South America recorded other regions with accuracy confirmed by modern archaeology. They noted agricultural techniques later validated by excavation. They described communities that still exist today, using terminology recognizable to local groups. For their supposed exaggerations to apply only to one region, while maintaining accuracy everywhere else, requires an inconsistency in human behavior that has no parallel in their writings. As for natural decay, the timeline refuses to cooperate. Structures built of stone do not disappear in a generation. Terraces do not flatten evenly without evidence of landslides or major ecological disruption. Roads carved into mountains do not soften into ambiguous paths without leaving cut marks or stone supports. Decay explains erosion, not erasure. The more each explanation is tested, the more it strains under the weight of physical reality. A settlement recorded on several independent maps should appear in at least one archaeological survey with recognizable form. A culture robust enough for advanced engineering should leave behind debris, tools, or burial sites. A city with trade connections should leave traces in the goods exchanged with neighboring groups. Yet the contradictions remain. Maps show what the ground does not. Journals describe what the soil barely remembers, and modern analysis is left holding fragments that refuse to match the scale required by the written accounts. This is the moment when the official explanations begin to thin. Not because historians are wrong, but because the evidence no longer fits neatly within their frameworks. The disappearance of these settlements is too uniform, too synchronized, too intentionally quiet, which forces us to ask a more uncomfortable question. If the accepted explanations fail to account for what is missing, then what exactly are they protecting us from seeing? What begins as a pair of isolated contradictions becomes far more unsettling when viewed across a broader canvas. The pattern does not limit itself to a single coastline or mountain range. It stretches quietly across continents, appearing in records that should have no connection to one another. Places vanish in different centuries under different empires within different climates, yet the shape of their disappearance remains eerily consistent. Once you see it, the world map looks less like a fixed representation of our past and more like a palimpsest, a surface rewritten again and again until only the faintest traces of earlier truth survive. The first location that reveals this broader pattern lies in Central Asia. early Persian and Chinese travelers described a chain of fortified towns stretching across the steppes, positioned along trade corridors older than the Silk Road itself. They noted wells, caravan stations, and defensive structures built with a sophistication that implied a long-established presence. Several maps from the 10th to 12th centuries mark these towns with uniform symbols, suggesting recognized significance. Yet by the time of the Mongol expansion, these towns begin to vanish from the records, not conquered, not burned, not absorbed, simply removed. Today only shallow depressions in the earth and scattered pottery shards hint at where they once stood. The scale of the infrastructure described in the early accounts does not match the scale of the remains, as though vast portions of these settlements were lifted away rather than ruined. Location B lies in northern Europe. Scandinavian coastal charts from the late medieval period show small communities along the fjords of Norway and Iceland that do not appear in later records. These are noted not as isolated farmsteads, but as gathering sites, places with docks, workshops, and defensive earthworks. Modern archaeology confirms activity in these areas, but the remains are minimal, insufficient to match the scale depicted in the maps. Some historians attribute this to temporary fishing stations, but the depth of the structures described contradicts that. These were not seasonal outposts, they were settlements large enough to appear on national charts, then small enough to leave barely a shadow on the land. Location C takes us to Southeast Asia, where Portuguese and Dutch navigators documented inland cultures along rivers now considered sparsely populated during that era. They described engineered waterways, elevated walkways, and wooden fortifications that suggest organized societies adapted to monsoon flooding. Yet modern archaeology finds only intermittent traces, as though the majority of structures were removed rather than allowed to decay. The pattern matches the others: detailed early accounts, consistent mapping, and a physical record that feels deliberately reduced. When these cases are viewed individually, they seem like mere curiosities, oddities scattered through history. But when placed side by side, the shape becomes unmistakable. Settlements appear with clarity in early records, then fade completely in later ones. Physical traces remain, but in quantities far too small to match the complexity described. The disappearances cluster disproportionately along ancient trade routes, migration corridors, and regions with strategic geography. The logic becomes difficult to ignore. If these were random errors, they would vary in form and distribution. If they were exaggerations, the physical remains would not match the earliest description so closely. But the pattern is consistent. Cultures described with confidence are later written out. Maps once full become sparse. Landscapes once busy grow quiet. And so the question that once belonged to a single anomaly now spans the entire globe. If so many regions, in so many eras, show the same signs of careful disappearance, then what force, known or unknown, could have thinned these histories so precisely? When a pattern repeats across continents, the instinct is to search for a single cause powerful enough to shape it. Historians tend to avoid such explanations, preferring localized answers. A drought here, invasion there, economic decline somewhere else. These events do happen, and they do reshape populations. Yet none of them can account for settlements that appear consistently in maps and journals, only to be excised from later records with near-surgical precision. Something is missing from the accepted timeline, a variable not yet acknowledged, one that operates quietly across centuries. The first clue lies in the nature of the settlements themselves. The places that vanish are not monumental capitals or centres of empire. They are border towns, mountain enclaves, river communities, and trade outposts positioned in locations of strategic importance. They sit at crossroads where goods, cultures, and knowledge intertwined. They're gateways, sometimes between ecologies, sometimes between civilizations, sometimes between worlds that rarely interacted directly. These were not the largest societies, but they were the connective tissue of the ancient world. The second clue lies in the infrastructure described in early accounts. Terraces engineered with precision, fortifications that required coordinated labour, agricultural systems adapted to extreme environments. These features appear repeatedly, whether in Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas. They suggest a form of knowledge passed silently across continents, long before globalization. Not a single global civilization, but a shared architectural grammar, a way of shaping land that does not fit neatly within the development timelines assigned to each region. The third clue lies in the speed of erasure. Cultures rise and fall slowly, leaving behind transitional layers. Their disappearance is traceable through pottery styles, burial practices, and changes in architecture. But the vanished settlements do not follow this rhythm. They disappear abruptly, often between two map editions, sometimes within a single generation. The land remembers only the faintest outlines, as if someone scraped away the bulk of the evidence and left behind only what could not be fully removed. These clues invite a quieter, more cautious interpretation. Not a forgotten empire or a lost race, but a set of societies that played a different role in the ancient world than we currently understand. They may have been brokers of knowledge, intermediaries, carriers of techniques that moved faster than the cultures that adopted them. Their influence may have been more diffuse, less tied to ethnicity or kingdom, more tied to shared practices passed through networks that modern categories cannot easily capture. If this is true, then their disappearance would not reflect the fall of a single civilization. It would reflect the removal of a layer of history that once connected others, a layer that made sense of how knowledge travelled, how techniques spread, how ideas moved long before written records attempted to explain them. When that layer was erased, the connections dissolved. The surviving cultures appeared more isolated, more independent, more disconnected than they truly were. This interpretation does not claim a hidden empire or a conspiracy. It proposes something simpler, that our maps once recorded a level of connectivity the modern narrative does not acknowledge, and that someone at some time had reason to pare that connectivity away, leaving only fragments behind. Which leads us toward a thoughtful, unsettling possibility. What if history did not lose these places because they were unimportant, but because they were the threads that explained too much? If this hidden layer ever existed, then its presence should leave measurable marks. Not legends, not speculation, physical traces that resist erasure. And when you look closely, those traces begin to surface in categories that rarely get examined together. The first category is cartographic persistence. Early maps show a settlement repeatedly, then later maps erase it. But when those early maps are compared using modern geographic alignment, their positions overlap to a degree that makes coincidence improbable. The Portuguese charts of West Africa place the vanished town at coordinates that, when converted to modern latitude and longitude, fall within a narrow margin of accuracy. The same applies to the missionary maps in South America and the medieval charts in Scandinavia. These cartographers, working centuries apart, shared nothing but their discipline. Yet their depictions of these now missing places aligned far too tightly to be dismissed as rumour or artistic license. Something existed there, mapped repeatedly, then removed with an uncanny level of consistency. The second category is architectural signature. The faint remains in these regions share unusual traits. Stonework that does not match local traditions, terraces shaped with a geometry that suggests standardized proportions, foundations that imply multi-story structures in cultures not known for building upward. These traits appear faintly in Africa, more prominently in the Andes, subtly in Southeast Asia, and unexpectedly across pockets of Central Asia. They form a recurring architectural fingerprint, one that does not align with the dominant cultures of any of those regions. The similarities are too specific to be convergent evolution. They hint at a shared technique, perhaps even a shared lineage of knowledge, passed quietly across time. The third category is demographic math. The scale of certain terraces, canals, and road systems requires populations larger than the official records allow. Some Andean terraces span thousands of acres, far more than the surviving villages could have maintained. The Central Asian wells described by early travellers imply continuous use and coordinated labour. Scandinavian coastal earthworks suggest gatherings larger than the supposed population of the region at the time. The numbers do not add up. The infrastructure demands more hands than the archaeological record claims were present. The fourth category is soil disruption. When geologists analyse layers beneath these vanished settlements, they find disturbances that do not correspond to natural erosion. Soil compaction patterns suggest the removal of heavy structures. Sediment layers show shifts consistent with deliberate clearing. In some places, topsoil appears to have been redistributed, spread in ways that suggest human intervention on a large scale, not to build, but to hide. The land looks as though it was smoothed, its memory thinned. The fifth category is missing technology. Early written accounts describe water systems, surveying techniques, and agricultural methods that surpass what the surviving cultures of those regions could have developed independently at that time. In the Andes, missionaries described irrigation networks no longer visible. In West Africa, navigators spoke of stone granaries of a type unknown in the region today. In Southeast Asia, travellers wrote of elevated causeways far more advanced than those attributed to local groups. These technologies appear fully formed in the earliest accounts, then vanish without evolutionary traces. Knowledge does not usually disappear this completely. Taken together, these categories form a picture that is difficult to ignore. Maps that agree too precisely, architecture that spreads too widely, populations that must have been larger, soil that shows signs of intentional manipulation, technologies that flash briefly into the record then vanish without a trail. Individually, each piece might be explained away, but together they form a pattern of evidence that resists dismissal. A pattern suggesting that something once occupied these places, something organized, widespread, and interconnected, and that its absence is not the result of time but of deliberate removal. By now, the shape of the mystery no longer fits within the comfortable margins of accepted history. Too many maps agree. Too many structures hint at hands no longer counted. Too many landscapes carry the faint memory of something larger than what survived. The evidence forms a quiet outline of a world more connected, more layered, and more complex than the timeline we inherited suggests. And within that outline is a question that grows heavier the longer you sit with it. If so many settlements disappear across so many regions in the same unnatural way, then what exactly was removed? It is not enough to say a city was abandoned. Cities leave debris. It is not enough to say a culture collapsed. Cultures leave transitions, and it is not enough to say the early accounts were mistaken, because the physical traces that remain still echo the descriptions too closely. Something once sat in these places, something structured and intentional, something that connected distant regions through a network of shared techniques, shared architecture, shared knowledge. And then, for reasons lost to us, that something was taken away, not destroyed in a single catastrophe, not erased through conquest alone, but removed in a manner too clean, too synchronized, too quiet to belong to any natural process of decline. Removed so thoroughly that history had to grow new explanations to fill the empty spaces left behind. Which leads us to a question that sits at the edge of everything we think we know about the past. If entire settlements scattered across continents could be erased so completely that only traces remain, then how much of our world has been shaped by absences we've mistaken for emptiness? And if these vanished places once served as bridges between cultures, repositories of knowledge, or meeting points for ideas that travelled farther than our textbooks admit, then another question follows. What other parts of our history depend on structures that are no longer there to support them? Because if whole chapters can be removed without leaving clear evidence of their authors, then we must ask, calmly and without illusion, what else have we been living atop without ever knowing it existed? The world we inherit always feels complete. Its maps seem final, its borders settled, its histories fixed into place like stones in an old foundation. But when you look closely enough, when you let your eyes adjust to the faintest lines, you begin to see the spaces where something once lived. Not legends, not fantasies, but the quiet residue of people whose stories no longer appear in the books we write about ourselves. The earth remembers them in small ways, in the curve of a terrace weathered nearly flat, in the fragment of a wall that aligns too perfectly with a distant counterpart, in the way a river bends where old maps insisted it once met a settlement. Their presence lingers like a low note beneath a piece of music, unheard until you listen for it, unmistakable once you do. There is no certainty here, only a soft reminder that the world is older, broader, and more layered than the narrative that has survived. Some histories remain not because they were protected, but because they were too large to fully erase. Others faded because the threads that connected them were removed, leaving only scattered hints behind. What remains is the outline of a story that asks more than it answers, and perhaps that is the truth worth holding on to, that absence can be evidence, that silence can carry memory, that the unknown is not a void but a landscape still waiting to be understood. If you seek forgotten stories, the quiet ones, the ones written between the lines of the world we think we know, consider subscribing and joining us on this journey into the parts of history that refuse to stay buried. Because sometimes the most revealing truths are found not in what survived, but in what was taken away.